Okay, let's give me a second till it turns red here. You're good to go, Victor.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. For you that don't know me, my name is Victor Shelton. I am the state agronomist and grazing specialist here in Indiana. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of highly erodible land. We'll review types of erosion, what makes a field highly erodible, look at some history, and also look at some planning considerations. The Food Security Act's highly erodible land provisions were enacted to protect our nation's long-term capability to produce food and fiber. To participate in most USDA programs, agricultural producers with HEL must manage those HEL fields according to an approved conservation plan or conservation system, which protects the land from water, wind, and ephemeral gully erosion. You know, erosion happens. It is or should be a very slow process. It's a natural process. But when we have major disturbances, especially when they're occurring frequently, then we're going to have erosion. It's going to happen faster. When soils are not protected with plants, residue, or lack that natural soil structure, they are more likely to erode. Erosion, of course, is the movement of soil particles from where they originated to other locations. That could be within the landscape or topography, or possibly carried by flowing water miles and miles away. Erosion is the greatest where rainfall amounts and intensity are the highest. Some soils are naturally more erodible than others. Of course, steep and long slopes produce more erosion than short and flat slopes. Land use certainly does also have an effect on erosion. When exposing the soil to raindrops and surface runoff, we're dramatically increasing erosion potential. We're going to talk a little bit about all this today. For some soils, such as silt loams, it doesn't take much exposure to the elements to have sheet and rill erosion. Sheet erosion is quite often really hard to see unless you look at it super close, but it can add up pretty quickly, especially over time. Sheet erosion is the removal of surface soil by the action of the raindrop splash and then runoff. This is often tied then to rill erosion, where shallow flows of surface water continue to move those soil particles with minute concentrations of flow. Some soils, especially ones with fine particles, I'm very familiar with, like most silt loams, seem to erode sometimes just like sugar in the rain. If we look at it on a 1 acre basis, sometimes it kind of brings it to light. The soil pile on the left here is what 4 tons of soil loss look like for 1 year. On the right-hand side is what 4 tons looks like over 40 years. Several of our soils have a T value, a soil loss tolerance value of 4 tons per year. So this is what's leaving the field every single year, and it's what's tolerable. So think about that and think what it would be like if it was above the T level. I would hope that we could do a lot better than this. To give a better size perspective, what we're really looking at there, the red arrow there is pointing towards a 4-foot high metal T-post. So that kind of gives you an idea of how much soil is actually possibly leaving the field. We should be concerned about erosion. It certainly degrades the soils, reducing productivity and organic matter, and certainly allows for loss of nutrients. It can certainly also cause downstream and sediment issues. the county highway department will quickly tell you how much they spend in some areas to clean out ditches that have filled with sediment. Sediment can also be a pollutant itself, affecting water quality because it can carry nutrients and applied chemicals off-site where they can do damage. Where erosion is likely to be a problem, you know, in general, erosion is greatest if vegetative cover, including residue from last year's crop, is low or absent, and where tillage is excessive with a lot of surface disturbance, and where conventional tillage operations are going on, especially when they're going directly up and down slopes. We can create perfect scenarios, and we see them quite often where the field is just set up to have a lot of erosion problems. Erosion can also be a problem on overgrazed pastures and even disturbed sites with limited cover. And so it's not hard to find erosion out there. I wish I had 3 soil monoliths for the same soil under different long-term management systems to kind of really show you here. But we're going to use these diagrams that I've made. I've seen some remarkable differences over the years. And these diagrams here hopefully will illustrate those differences. All of the same soil type is what it was labeled. So kind of use your imagination here just a little bit. These represent a Hosmer silt loam, all labeled a Hosmer C2. The first one is on a rare site that has never been cropped and remained in pasture since the early 1800s. The topsoil varies on this site from 8 to 17 inches in deep. So there's a lot more topsoil than what is really normal. A half-mile away is a long-term no-till field that has been cropped more severely in the past, but now has 3 to 5 inches of topsoil on it. The third site here has been farmed hard for an extremely long time, and most of it, if not all the topsoil, has eroded away. In reality, site 1 is more like a Alford silt loam than a Hosmer because of the depth, and it is kind of outside of the normal soil description for that soil. Site 2 is probably very average for a Hosmer C2, as described by the soil survey. And site 3 is heavily eroded and is probably now should have a prefix of a 3 after it, meaning it's severely eroded. So just because they were all labeled the same thing in the soil survey doesn't mean that that's what they still are. Reels may be any size, but are almost always less than 4 inches deep. They are often the upper branches of a ephemeral gully trunk. Reels are eliminated very easily by tillage or even farmed over and may appear at different locations on the landscape from year to year. They generally occur on side slopes above drainage ways. They almost always end at a concentrated flow channel and occasionally at a terrace. They are usually on the same portion of the slope that is used to determine the length of slope, the slope factor, the L factor for Russell 2. Sheet and rill erosion is considered in the Russell calculations. Now, ephemeral gullies are larger than a reel and smaller than a gully. Makes sense. It usually results from the junction of reels that form a branching or tree-like pattern of the channels. If you look at this picture closely, you can see that tree-like pattern. The reels up above are the branches and the ephemerals down below are the trunk. Ephemeral gullies do typically reoccur in the same area each time they form rather than randomly at different places on a slope. They frequently form in well-defined shallow depressions in natural drainage ways. They usually occur in the upper reaches of a drainage network and are easily noted on LiDAR maps. They are generally wider, deeper, and longer than the reels in the field. They can occasionally occur in rows, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. They can certainly be partially or totally erased and filled in by tillage operations, but not really something that you'd want to plant across if left as is. Soil from the surrounding areas is used to level these off when they're fixed with tillage. The filling results in a soil decline over a larger area than the gully itself. Soil is typically removed to the depth of the tillage layer that's been going on out there. Now, detachment and transport is, of course, by flowing concentrated water. It is certainly possible to have ephemerals without reels, and we'll see that occasionally on some reduced tillage systems. Ephemeral gullies are not calculated into the equation for Russell 2. If you look at this aerial photo here, the red arrows on it indicate where you're most likely to find ephemeral gullies. The yellowish or the light yellowish areas there generally are where you're going to be seeing or finding sheet and reel erosion. Reels that are induced by tillage going up and down the slope can turn into ephemeral gullies also, even though they are not in those normal concentrated water flow areas. This sometimes is also seen on in-rows because the rows in the field lead the water from the field to the field edge occasionally. In this picture, the rails are highly influenced by up and down slope tillage on the in-rows. These are leading to ephemeral gullies. And if you look at where the red arrows are, you can see small head cuts starting to form. In the background of this picture, where I have the yellow arrow, you can see a ephemeral gully back there. Now, classic gullies usually occur from untreated ephemerals on cropland long term. They occur in well-defined drainage ways. They're certainly not eliminated by tillage. They're almost always typically greater than 18 inches deep. Quite often they'll be eroded down to the depth of the profile. They have well-defined sidewalls generally, and possibly even slumping of large areas from year to year. And again, classic gullies are not calculated in by Russell 2. We do have soils in Indiana that are subject to wind erosion. Unprotected soil particles are either bounced or rolled across the soil surface or lifted up and suspended in the air and sometimes moved great distances. This old map on the right-hand side from 1997 indicates counties where wind erosion is more likely to be an issue. These soils generally tend to be fine, very fine sandy soils and occasionally mucks. The combination of dry, droughty conditions and large amounts of plowed fields with no protection that were common at the time frame is what led to the 1930s Dust Bowl. A little bit of history here. Hugh Hammond Bennett, the father of soil conservation, led the soil conservation movement in the United States, urging the nation to address the national menace of soil erosion. His efforts led him to be the first appointed director of the Soil Erosion Service in 1933, and later was persuading and instrumental of a new federal agency, the Soil Conservation Service, which he was the first chief. Effects of the Dust Bowl were timed just right for several things to happen. If you're not familiar with the history of the Soil Conservation Service and Nrcs, then I would encourage you to read up on it. Interestingly, some of us have been around long enough and have worked for both Soil Conservation Service and Nrcs. You know, something's changed with the 1980 Farm Bill, the Food Security Act. It instructed that we needed to have a substantial reduction in erosion. It provided provisions for compliance on HEL land that was cropped prior to December 23rd, 1985, and also provisions for any HEL land that was brought into production after that date. Producers farming HEL land needed a conservation plan to document how they would comply with the bill. So at that time, we got busy and we wrote an awful lot of plans, most of them by hand. We actually really didn't get or start using computers much until about 1989. I guess for some of your younger people out there, can you imagine doing everything we do today without computers? Probably not. I remember quite well back in the 80s, producers walking in the door of the office and stating, "I understand that I need one of those HEL plans. Is this where I get it?" And you would politely reply, "Yes, and we can help you develop that HEL plan." Here's a question for everybody. We'll see if anybody knows. What year was the Soil Conservation Service founded? Oh, I can't see them. Can you? Are we getting any answers?
Vic, this is Al, 1937 or 1935, 1940, 1933.
Those are all pretty good answers and close answers.
1935.
1935 on April 27th. April 27th, 1935, the Soil Conservation Service was founded. The Soil Erosion Service was started in 1933. Does anybody know what year Nrcs came about, where we had our name changed from Soil Conservation Service to Nrcs?
Somebody thinks 1994, 1996, 1995.
It was 1994. How do we have any questions so far? And
not related to what you're teaching.
All right, and we'll proceed on. The T value stands for soil loss tolerance for a specific soil. It's the maximum average annual soil loss expressed as tons per acre per year that will permit current production levels to be maintained economically and hopefully indefinitely. T values range from 1 to 5 tons per acre per year. The Farm Bill allows for up to 2 times the tolerable level, 2T, for any highly erodible land that was farmed prior to December 23rd, 1985. If it was brought into production after that, then it should be farmed to 1T. In the late 1980s, we were allowed to develop alternative conservation systems ACS plans. These were commonly called residue plans. This was mainly to help a few states get caught up in planning. They were supposed to still provide for a significant reduction in soil loss. They were to hopefully make things easier, and they were based mainly on those residue amounts that were left after planting. ACS plans being based pretty much only on residue amounts didn't always get the same erosion control as earlier plans and often had over 2 times the tolerable soil loss. Real ACS plans today are plans that have to be approved by the state conservationists because they are over 2T, but not over 4T. If they'd happen to be over 4T, then they would actually have to go to the regional conservationists for approval. These plans are normally for specialty crops or for special situations. Now, if a producer still has a copy of one of those original ACS residue plans, and it's dated prior to July 3rd, 1996, then they are in compliance if they're still following those plans. Residue amounts would be documented during status reviews, and unfortunately, a lot of times ephemeral gully control was not included in those plans, so we still need to make sure that we're adding those to those plans. Now, on July 3rd, 1996, I just mentioned that 96 Farm Bill was passed, and it defined and stressed that substantial reduction in soil loss. And they want to make sure that it was no more than 2 times the tolerable soil loss for the predominant HEL map unit. At about that same time, we started accepting conservation systems that met the criteria, and you didn't necessarily have to have a plan as long as you met the substantial reduction and you were following that approved system. Let's fast forward for a minute to 2015. The Office of Inspector General, OIG, reviewed HEL compliance procedures in 4 states. And in their report, OIG noted that HEL compliance rules were being inconsistently implemented across a lot of state lines. Big items at that time were some people were still writing ACS plans, even though they were supposed to have stopped in 96, and ephemeral gullies were also not being addressed. So in response to that OIG report, 2 documents were distributed by the national headquarters. First, a national bulletin clarifying that sheet and reel and wind erosion compliance levels had to be within 2T, and states were directed to remove and archive any ACS residue plans. Most importantly for Indiana, we needed to take ephemeral gullies a lot more seriously. So then later, a circular was issued in early 2017. That circular outlined clarifications to HEL compliance in regards to the ephemeral gully erosion control. And we're going to talk more about this. On fields that are determined to be HEL, sheet and reel, ephemeral, and wind erosion needs to be controlled, period. It doesn't include classic gullies or stream or other erosion types. First, just to make sure everybody understands, HEL stands for highly erodible land. HEL could be cropland, hayland, or pasture that erodes at excessive rates, but for compliance, we look at only cropland. Each state maintains a listing of HEL soils in the Field Office Technical Guide. We must first look and see if the dominant soil types are highly erodible or not. We can then see if there is enough HEL soils to make or designate the field to be highly erodible. We first turn to what I refer to as the frozen list. The frozen list provides a lot of information. The things that we'll focus on are R, K, and T values for water erosion. Frozen means frozen in time. No changes to this data was made after January 1, 1990. This list is used for all HEL determinations. Soils are classified into 3 HEL classes, 1, 2, and 3. Ones are HEL soils, period. 3s are always in HEL, non-highly erodible land. 2s are PHEL, potentially highly erodible land. And those need further investigation because they're too close to call one way or another without measuring the slopes. And we do have some GIS tools that have made this a heck of a lot easier and faster, and probably a lot more accurate. The frozen lists are found in section 2 of the Field Office Technical Guide under detailed soil information. You choose the county that you're working in and then find the highly erodible soils list. The Erodibility Index of each soil map unit in a field is used as the basis for identifying whether it's highly erodible for the Food Security Act compliance. The frozen list separates out HEL and NHL soils. We saw that. PHL soils or Class 2 soils vary way too much to call one way or another without actually collecting that field data. So we're going to go look at how we do this. The erodibility index of a soil is determined by dividing the potential erodibility for each soil by the soil loss tolerance, which is established for each soil type. We'll base the HEL determination off the frozen list values or factors. The rainfall erosion factor, the R factor, the erosion factor, a soil erodibility factor, the K value, and the T values of each soil don't change. The one factor that can be different from field to field is the LS value. If in doubt, or if the soil was labeled a PHEL soil on the frozen list, then we need to measure the slopes. We do have a new GIS tool, like I mentioned, now that can do this quickly and more accurately, and probably with a little less bias at times. But that technology isn't always available for every county yet, and it certainly doesn't hurt to know how to figure this anyway. We'll use all this information to figure the EI, the Erodibility Index. If the EI is greater than 8, then the soil is considered HEL. If this is the deciding factor or the line in the sand between HEL and NHEL. The main variables that determine how topography affects the erosion include slope length and steepness. In the field, you would generally use a kilometer or measure a percent slope. You can use a rod in transit or a hand level. Let's look quickly at some ways to measure these slopes. The traditional way of applying erosion prediction for conservation planning is to measure the distance from the origin of the overflow where it starts to the concentrated flow point, or where deposition begins. That location of deposit may vary some from soils to soils and fields to field. This slide here kind of illustrates the two major portions of a concave slope. The slope length and slope from start of overland flow to the edge of deposition area can be used to compute the soil loss on the eroding portion of the hillside. You'll need to take several shots in the field and find the average slope and slope length. And that's going to kind of depend on the size of the field and the amount of area that you're looking at for this particular soil unit. If you happen to have a field that has both concave and convex slopes, then the slope length to where deposition begins can be used to compute the soil loss on the upper end or the upper part of the slope. However, you're going to need to use the entire length to capture that concave and convex slopes for that lower part. So the entire slope length must be used to compute soil loss on the lower portion of the slope if you need to separate these out. And this is fairly common. The table I have here is different than the ones that were published about 1996 for Russell 2 in section 1 of the Field Office Technical Guide. This is actually out of the 1978 version that is used primarily just for HEL determinations. It comes from the booklet predicting rainfall erosion losses. The tables published later are used in the background of Russell 2 and Webb. So if we measured the slope and we found it was 4% at 100 feet, and we can look it up on this chart and see that our LS value is 0.400. We use the values from that frozen list for water erosion, say 200 for rainfall, 0.43 for the erosion factor, 0.400 for that LS value we just looked up and we measured in the field, and of course the T value for the soil that we're reviewing. In this case, it's a 3. To calculate this out, we get 11.5 as the EI, the erosion index. If the EI is greater than 8, then that soil is considered HEL. 75% of any PHEL map unit has to be HEL to be considered HEL. So the LS value used needs to represent that unit out there quite well. Quite a few PHEL soils, like the one in this picture, can be kind of misleading until actually measured. Most PHEL soils have slopes from 2 to 4%, and they can a lot of times have fairly long slopes. If a field is found to be in HEL, not highly erodible, then it can be farmed without restriction in regard to the cropping system. Of course, all are subject to wetland compliance, and Al will talk about that more in a little while. A copy of the LS chart for HEL determinations can be found on the FOTG under section 2 and under highly erodible land determinations. Also located under section 2 of the tech guide under highly erodible land determinations is a EI tool that can be used if you desire. This form will ask for the measured slope and slope length. It will fill in the rest of the soil information. It documents the determination data for each field. The new GIS HEL tool also generates a form very similar if it's used. Now we know that, well, we know what makes up a soil unit and as classified as HEL or not. So now let's look back at what makes a land unit or a field HEL. Highly erodible land determinations are made on a field basis or a CLU basis. A field has to meet either the 33 1/3% rule or the 50-acre rule based on the soil survey map units in the field in order to be determined HEL. the frozen soils data and the maps, again, must be used. If the soil is PHEL, then you'll have to make that determination for those soil units, just like we talked about, to determine if they will be included in those HEL acres or not. Here's an example field. If we were doing this like we did 30 years ago, we'd be counting dots in the soil survey to figure out how many acres of each soil type there was. Certainly, it's a heck of a lot easier now. There is a significant amount of PHEL and NHEL soils on this field, but not enough to override the HEL acres that are present. It's easiest probably to first see how many acres of HEL soil units are present. In this case, there's 15.7 acres, which is over 33.3% of the field. So this one soil unit, the Hosmer C3, makes up 33.7% of the field. So it not only makes the field HEL, but also dominant HEL soil unit, which we would use for planting. If the HEL acres were less than 33.3%, then those PHEL soil units that we have here become the deciding factor, and we'll need to figure out whether they are HEL or not. Otherwise, it's not that big of a deal. It's common for field boundaries to change over time. We perform a determination when land is brought into production or when CLU boundaries change. For example, of a boundary change, reconstitution, like we call them quite often. Let's look at this example. Policy prohibits combining fields to dilute HEL acres and to below that 33.3% or even the 50-acre threshold. Technically, when you combine a HEL and NHEL field together, it makes the whole field HEL. But only the original HEL portion still has to be treated as HEL. The rest can still continue as it was before, but there are exceptions. When HEL and NHEL fields are combined, and the combination of the two create the new field, and it happens to be greater than 33.3% HEL soils or greater than 50 acres of HEL soil units present, then the whole field will be labeled HEL and will have to follow the HEL guidelines. Likewise, if two NHEL fields are combined, and now that it happens to have enough HEL units between the two to meet the 33.3% or 50-acre rule, then that determination can change. But that doesn't happen very often, probably for a good thing. For a field to be highly erodible by wind erosion, it still has to have a erodibility index and EI value greater than 8. This is a different calculation than for water erosion, and the information can be found for this equation on the frozen list, again, for most counties. But for most part, no worries, because you're probably not going to find a soil here in Indiana with an EI greater than 8 just for wind. A soil unit is HEL if the water erosion is greater than 8. And if wind erosion happens to be greater than 8, it's also HEL. For HEL determinations, these are looked at separately and not added together. It is possible that a field could be HEL for both wind and water, but not likely here in Indiana. Here's a question for you. And hopefully this is a very easy one. What makes the EI of a soil, what's the EI of the soil have to be considered HEL? Do you have any answers, Al? Any response, Al? Well, the answer would be greater than 8. I was hoping people would not just say 8 because it has to be greater than 8. So if we determine a field to be HEL, it will need to be managed appropriately as directed by the Food Security Act of 1985. The HEL provisions in the law provide variances for producers participating in government programs to farm the HEL land. Again, if it's NHEL, non-highly erodible land, then it can be farmed without restrictions in regard to the cropping system. Anytime that a producer contacts us or walks in the office asking for assistance with a problem, we should look at this as a planning and perhaps a educational opportunity. Some producers or landowners still don't know what all we can assist them with. A little bit of technical assistance can certainly lead to a conservation plan and then positive results on our resources out there and fixing resource concerns from good applied conservation. Producers farming HEL land should have a conservation plan, but they don't have to as long as they're following a system. That said, a plan certainly doesn't hurt. To participate in most USDA programs, agricultural producers of HEL must manage those fields according to that approved conservation plan or conservation system, which protects the land from water, wind, and ephemeral gully. As long as they're doing that, they're good to go, plan or no plan. This conservation plan documents a treatment and sometimes can open doors for financial assistance. All assistance and plans should meet and be backed by our conservation practice standards and specifications. Conservation plans are the basis for all assistance Nrcs provides to clients and the basic tool for clients to manage their natural resources. I think the greatest value that comes by having the clients engaged in every step of the planning process. Nrcs, upon request, will provide technical assistance for conservation plan development. The plan is designated to provide certainty that the approved conservation measures will meet the HEL conservation requirements. The participant's decision for wind, water, and ephemeral gully control measures are scheduled and documented in that plan to ensure that we have at least a 75% reduction of the potential erosion, or at least is less than 2 times the tolerable soil loss for the predominant soil HEL soil unit, and that ephemeral gullies are controlled. HEL fields that were farmed prior to December 23rd, 1985 just need to be kept to 2T, like we said before. But farmers proposing to grow agricultural commodities on land that did not have cropping history prior to December 23rd, 1985, these are also known as sodbusters, must notify FSA of their new cropland on the Form AD 1026. The notification will be referred to Nrcs to determine if the field is HEL or not. And then the participant in FSA will be notified with a form CPA 026. If the field is HEL, the program participant is required to implement a conservation plan or system that limits the erosion to the tolerable soil loss T, that's 1 T, for the predominant HEL soil on the sod busted fields. Sod busting is the removal of native vegetation. Here in Indiana, that is usually trees, but it occasionally can be prairie remnants. Keeping erosion to 1 T is not an easy task for some soils. In order to be within the T value with some soils, it may need to be in perennial forage part of the rotation. Note that we should be planting all sodbusters to this level, and the status on these don't change with time. If the potential sod busting can be discussed before any clearing is done, you can often eliminate surprises for that producer, especially when they find out they won't be able to farm it quite the way they want to. And sometimes they may even decide it's better off left alone. We need to run Russell 2 using the cropping sequence, cover crops, and times and types of tillage provided by the producer to document soil loss and see if it meets the erosion requirements. I'm not going to talk about Russell 2 today, but we are continuing to use this erosion prediction tool. WEP is presently still on hold. WEPs can be used for wind erosion if needed. We will try and spend more time on Russell 2 training in the near future to make sure everybody is up to speed. Russell 2 utilizes the soil data for the chosen planting soil for each field. That the planting soil should be the most dominant HEL soil map unit in the field.
We have a question.
Okay.
Victor, wanting to know how sod busted fields documented with FSA for future compliance review. So these are the ones with simple T.
Yeah, that's a very good question. A lot of those, the older sod busters were documented on the old, what I call 660 maps, the old handwritten maps, the big maps. FSA holds on to those records of all 1026s showing what has been broken out. And so they are the keeper of those records. And hopefully in most offices, we have duplicates to those records that we can refer back to. I think sometime in the future, we may possibly be able to have a GIS layer that shows where all those are at, but we don't have that at this point in time. But good question. Thank you. The circular that was issued in January of 2017, after that audit outlined, clarified that we really needed to be paying more attention to ephemeral gully control. So since that time frame, we've been trying to get producers to control ephemeral gullies to ease the workload and to allow sufficient time to address them. We chose here in Indiana to address them as they were found on status reviews and also with new and revised plans. This could change in the future. That's where we're operating right now. There may be fields that, even with the application of maximum conservation measures, no-till, high residue crops, cover crops, they can still exhibit sometimes ephemeral gully erosion. All these erosion locations must be identified and sufficiently treated in order to meet the HEL requirements. Temporary measures such as farming across those ephemeral gullies in order to obscure them is not considered a stabilization method. I always tell people, fix it, don't disc it. And we can certainly provide that assistance to help do that. All plans after January 2nd, 2017 will include ephemeral gully control if they don't already. This can easily be accomplished by addressing it in their conservation plan or providing them a copy of the HEL ephemeral gully plan addendum. Once notified, producers must be addressing ephemeral gullies. The need for ephemeral gully control may be found during the planning process. It could be requested even by the producer. It could be found during a status review and even occasionally by a 569. Control of ephemeral gullies begins with the minimizing of runoff by improving water infiltration and protecting that soil surface so we can slow down these water concentration areas. The soil health management system, which includes no-till and cover crops, and using the 4 principles of minimizing disturbance and maximizing soil cover and providing continuous living roots, maximizing biodiversity, may all help provide this control, but it doesn't always fix it. And if that's the case, then additional vegetative or structural practices may be needed. And the addendum walks you right through these steps. So if you can't fix it at one level, you just go up to the next level. I'll end today with a few planning thoughts and a couple of slides I stole from Ben Lambeck. Thanks, Ben, because I just thought they made really good points. Cover on the soil surface protects the soil from the raindrop impact. Systems that include good soil cover from crop residue and or from cover crops protect the soil from erosion. Surface disturbances also impact soil erosion. The less surface disturbance, the better. Soil health conservation cropping systems, such as no-till and cover crops, where there is minimal surface disturbance and where full width tillage is not allowed, really helps to reduce soil erosion. And what goes on below the soil surface also has an impact on soil erosion. The more tillage that occurs, especially deep tillage, the more potential there is for erosion under severe weather conditions. Soils that are regularly disturbed have a structure that tends to fall apart and collapse on itself, resulting in runoff and erosion. When a soil is tilled less, the structure is better maintained. When a soil is healthy, there is better function in the soil, allowing for better infiltration due to those glues holding the soils together to create water stable aggregates and then earthworms and root channels help take in large amounts of water with some of these crazy heavy rainfall events. With health comes function. And with functioning soil, you can manage soil erosion better. Thank you. Appreciate your time. Are there any last questions? All right, well, we'll take a short break here. And we have fundamentals of wetland compliance coming up next with Al Tinsley. And so let's take about a 5-minute break. and then we'll start up again. Thank you.
Hey, Shannon.
Yep.
What do you see on your screen?
You're good to go.
Okay.
I think Victor will be watching the chat for you, and you'll be good to go.
Anytime you want to start, Al.
Okay. I guess we will start now. So, for today's consideration, we're going to be talking about how conservation planning is affected by the 1985 Food Security Act. We're going to be talking about how you wound up in a field with a farmer talking about conservation planning. So that means we'll be getting into some of the specifics of the 1985 Food Security Act. And that will lead us into talking about the highly erodible land conservation and wetland conservation provisions. And that will take us into what exactly is a wetland. And then we'll cover some aspects of conservation planning and how it's all tied up in with what happened in 1985. So the first statement I want to make is that the highly erodible land conservation provisions and the wetland conservation provisions are actually a very important component of conservation planning. You know, I've grown up in the agency with conservation, doing conservation planning, and also dealing with HEL and wetlands. And it wasn't really till just a few years ago that I realized just how intertwined they were. We generally don't talk about them altogether. So they are important because you can't participate in any USDA programs, with very few exceptions, unless and until all your acres are squared away with the HEL, C, and WC provisions. These provisions are all about being eligible to participate in USDA programs by applying conservation to the land and to the wetlands. So once you're in compliance with the provisions, you can then participate in the USDA programs. And you're actually out of the programs if you can't stay in compliance and may have to return money. And I don't know if any of you have had the mispleasure of dealing with a farmer who turns out to have been out of compliance for many years and is looking at having to return significant amounts of money. That's a very heartbreaking situation. I've been forced to deal with that a couple of times, and I certainly want to avoid that at all costs, but sometimes it can't be helped. So the first thing that goes towards applying compliance to people is to not use the word compliance. That's a word best used amongst ourselves and not with the person that we're working with. We should let the laws and regulations speak for themselves. Our job is to be able to explain their presence, the provisions, and their purpose, while focusing on how we are here to assist them in participating in the programs. So if you start out from the right perspective with people, you'll be helping them with their program participation and figuring out how to do conservation better and better each year. And the fact that there are compliance parts to this really never needs to present itself. So Congress did make this big stick. Being taken out of the programs is a big stick, but we are the voice that keeps the stick unnoticed. So that is our responsibility for carrying out these provisions. So we want to develop a working relationship with our farmers. The programs are the tools we use to offer incentives to bring farmers into this relationship. So every time we get them into a program, we're building upon that relationship, getting them to a place where we can help them improve their business such that they enjoy being in our programs, and we'll keep doing that. The conservation provisions that use compliance are our tool to keep the relationship moving forward when all else fails. So the thing I want to stress here is that these are not just feel-good talking points that telling you about using the carrot instead of the stick or over the stick. The agency itself stresses that we are not to rely on compliance right out of the gate. So here, this is a sentence out of the National Food Security Act manual, where the evidence of compliance, including the USDA participants' records, is inconclusive. Do not assume compliance or non-compliance. Instead, grant a variance if appropriate. And then out of another sentence out of the same manual, a minor deficiency that may occur in a single year of a plan or system will not be the sole basis for non-compliance and will not result in a variance. And then we can go to the 7 CFR 12, the Code of Federal Regulations, that have chapters that tell us that actions based upon the advice or action of USDA employees will not put them in jeopardy of being ineligible if that advice or action turned out to be wrong. Other parts list exemptions related to both HEL and wetlands and converted wetlands that will keep people in the program. So both our regulations and our policies are telling us that we are looking to keep people in the program. Our goal is not to find the program breakers and kick them out. The goal is to use our relationships to keep them from becoming a breaker. And if they are a rule breaker, then our goal is to work with them to get them back into compliance so that they can continue to be part of our programs. So one thing I would like to do is explain why we keep talking about the National Food Security Act manual and the Code of Federal Regulations and how all that comes together. You don't usually get a talking to like this unless we're talking about compliance. This is something that the agency on the whole has really started doing in the last few years. So I I want to carry on what I've been taught in my learnings about our authorities and all. So the Code of Federal Regulations is the orderly arrangement of all the rules and regulations published in the Federal Register after an act of Congress is made into law. So we wind up with the United States Code, which is how the law that is passed by Congress is written down and recorded. That is taken by people in the agency and developed into regulations that are posted in the Federal Register that everybody can read and make comments on and participate in that process. And when that process is over, we wind up with a set of regulations that are put into the Code of Federal Regulations that I read all the time, and you can as well. that give our agency its direction on how to conduct itself. So our agency then takes that code of federal regulations and starts making manuals out of it. So for the National Food Security Act manual, the first paragraph says this manual contains the United States Department of Agriculture and Natural Resource Conservation Service policy and operating procedures for implementing Federal Regulation 7 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 12. So that is why we are doing what we're doing, not because our agency is coming up with all these neat, nifty ways of doing things. It's because Congress is coming up with these programs. Congress is providing the money to do these programs. And so we are getting our marching orders from Congress. And, and so let's look a little bit about how this this process continues on. So the Farm Bill is one of those pieces of legislation that Congress passes. It's considered a comprehensive piece of legislation that covers most federal government regulations and policies related to agriculture, including some things like federal welfare, parts of the federal welfare program, things like that, due to our history of providing surplus food stocks. The first Farm Bill was in 1933 and then renewed, and then it's renewed about every 5 years. So I'd like to go back to, I think it was Vic's program that talked about when the Soil Conservation Service started, 1933. So apparently our efforts have been there from the very beginning. And so in 1985, one of those farm bills was passed, and it allowed lower commodity price and income supports and established a dairy herd buyout program. Several enduring conservation programs were created, including Sodbuster, Swamp Buster, and the Conservation Reserve Program. It's been amended by legislation that occurred in 1990, 1996, 2002, 2008, and 2014. So as you can see from those dates, having it renewed about every 5 years is wishful thinking. I looked around for why every 5 years and didn't really find anything that explained why there was a specific time frame that Congress wanted to do, but it's something that they've shot for, and usually winds up going more on a 6-year basis than a 5-year basis. So that's why we have carryover short-term acts of Congress to keep it going until the new Farm Bill can be worked on. So after Congress passes that Farm Bill, the federal agencies are authorized by that legislation, that Farm Bill, to start making regulations. It's called rulemaking. And the process of rulemaking is governed by the Administrative Procedure Act. And this is a fascinating piece of legislation for those of you who are interested in governance and how governments work and how people are protected and affected by governance. So the Administrative Procedure Act includes for the publication of proposed rules, a period for commenting and participation in the decision making, and then the adoption and publication of the rule in the Federal Register. So all these things were set up by the APA. And actually, the Administrative Procedures Act, is a shortened title, what's known as the short title. The long title of the legislation is an act to improve the administration of justice by prescribing fair administrative procedures. So that is a pretty long and pretty specific title to an act. So I was interested in why that was happening, so I looked into it a little bit. This was passed in 1946, and it was in response to the fact that after the Roosevelt administration created all of these government agencies and programs to administer money to help deal with the Great Depression. It was called the New Deal, and there weren't rules for how these agencies were to work. And so the agencies were doing what they wanted. And sometimes they were hitting the mark, and other times they were favoring one group of people over another. They were favoring friends over people they didn't know. Some agencies were being careful in dealing with the public, making sure that they understood what was going on. Others weren't. So there was no commonality between how all the agencies were working. So Congress responded by creating this Administrative Procedure Act. It sounds like it would be a very dry document, but when you read the actual thing, it goes into detail on all the things that government has to do to protect the rights of the individual or the businesses that are being affected by the acts of that agency. So that was actually a pretty big deal, and it's cited today. And in fact, when you read about the administration losing a court case and having to start over again on making the regulations and all, it's usually because they were not following the Administrative Procedures Act, and they were trying to take shortcuts to get something done quicker than what the act allowed for. That happened quite a bit with the last administration, but it's something that frankly happens with every administration, because the rules in the Administrative Procedure Act are quite comprehensive, and so it can be actually easy to fall short of meeting what the APA requires agencies to do. So even though it's a gosh, how old would that be? 70 some years old. It's still very fresh and relevant today. So that takes us from laws to regulations. So we wind up with the Code of Federal Regulations. For us, doing the highly erodible land conservation and wetland conservation provisions, it takes up Part 12 of Title 7 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So there are, of course, other parts and titles that we pay attention to. The appeals process is found in Part 614 of Title 7 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And that spells out in much more detail than what we have in 7 CFR 12 on how to handle appeals. And the whole purpose of that is to make sure that we are in line with the Administrative Procedures Act. So when I hear everybody complaining, and I did too originally, about how many appeal takes a person can make on their wetland determination. That is what is happening. We are giving them all the rights that they have under the Administrative Procedures Act on appealing something that they disagree with. So all of that is put in there to make sure that the one thing the farmer can't complain about is that they weren't given their ability to appeal and argue a determination. So the wetland conservation provisions, also known as the Swamp Buster, prohibit USDA program participants from converting specific kinds of wetlands to cropland, pasture, or hayland unless the wetland is compensated by the restoration of another converted wetland or wetlands. So there's a lot of very specific wording in there that kind of gives a hint that the regulations and the policies that flow from it are going to be pretty deep. So, and that is something that we find in our CFR, that we're given pretty specific things that we have to do. So we can't ignore those. We can't not do them. There are things that we have to do. And so while it gives us very good direction on what to do, it also limits our options and keeps us on a straight and narrow path and doesn't leave us much opportunity to look at alternatives to handle situations. And this is all because of Congress. Regulations can be very skimpy, simply authorizing the agency to make a policy, or it can be very specific. And we talked earlier about the Clean Water Act and versus what we do, the Food Security Act. And that's really an interesting premise. When the Clean Water Act was passed, it was very broad and open-ended. The regulations that came out is because they were required by the Clean Water Act were very skimpy, so that there wasn't much there. And in fact, there was so little there that the Corps of Engineers doesn't even have a manual on how to implement the Clean Water Act. They refer simply to the Code of Federal Regulations. So we make manuals, the Corps of Engineers does not, which is why they weren't even paying attention to wetlands with the Clean Water Act until they were sued by the National Wildlife Federation, I believe. And the Corps lost. And so the Corps had to develop all these regulations to implement the Clean Water Act for wetlands. And so that's why if you pay attention to what's going on with wetlands in the Clean Water Act, that's why they keep having to fight over it, because there's not much in the way of the legislation to provide guidance. So it's very easy to argue about whether their regulations are correct or not, whereas ours are pretty cut and dry. So the regulations are taking, and the Code of Federal Regulations, and then employees for Nrcs take those and they start reassembling them into manuals. And so that gives us the how to do it books for the HELC and WC provisions. So if you notice, we've got lots of manuals and handbooks. Our agency loves to have manuals and handbooks, which I think is a good deal, because it gives us something to pay attention to and fall back on when we're wanting to know how to do things. So our manuals cover things like general administration, the conservation programs, the National Engineering Manual. We've got a National Environmental Compliance Manual that we take a look at from time to time. Then we have a National Appeals and Mediation Manual built into the Conservation Planning Manual, the Conservation Programs Manual. And then we have the National Planning Procedures Manual. And these are just a few of the manuals and handbooks that we have that cite the Code of Federal Regulations for the reason for their being. So it's actually pretty interesting when you're going to the wetland trainings, the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Like I said, they get a lot more into what happens when these things become policy. And it's pretty amazing to think about how this happens, but it also explains an important facet that we have to take into consideration, and that this is a human endeavor. And so a lot of times what happens is the National Food Security Act manual tells us to do something. And then the people that wrote the National Appeals and Mediation Manual tell us to do that something in a different way. And so we are giving conflicting guidance on how to do something for instance, in the appeals process. And it gets interesting, it gets aggravating. It's something that we have to figure out how to deal with because, both policies are out there. So as a result, we wind up consulting with the national people and the regional people at the National Tech Support Centers. Ours is out in Fort Worth, but we also work with the East and the West Tech Center as well to get advice on how to deal with these conflicts. So a lot of times it appears that we are zigzagging back and forth and not always in compliance ourselves with our policies, but that often is the result. So I know I've become a lot more tolerant of these things after I got to the state office and realized what was going on. So like I said, it is aggravating, but from that standpoint, it is what it is. So all we can do is the best we can do and move forward with the decisions that are made. So for the exact provisions, we have the HELC provisions where HEL, highly erodible land converted before 1985, must not have erosion rates that exceed twice the tolerable level of soil erosion. HEL converted after 1985 must not have erosion rates that exceed the tolerable level of soil erosion. So that question earlier about how do we know when we're looking at land that we have to get down to T, that sod buster, that's what we call sod buster, is the land that was busted out of sod, so to speak, after 1985. So that has to be kept at a simple tolerable level of soil erosion instead of the twice the level for something that was busted up before 85. And how we figure that out isn't easy, and I don't think right now that we really have a simple solution to that, because we've been talking amongst ourselves about how to make sure that we don't lose focus on those acres that have to be kept down to T, not 2T. So I know we've been pushing this, and hopefully we can develop something that will make it easier to keep track of those. And then, of course, Vic also talked about the wind erosion that must be controlled and the ephemeral gullies that must be controlled. So for the wetland provisions, Food Security Act wetlands converted between 12/23/85 and 11/28/90 can't be improved upon on what was done before 1990. It can be maintained, but it can't be improved upon. And after that 11/28/90 date, it can't be cropped. I mean, it couldn't be cropped. I'm sorry, it couldn't be cropped between that 85 and the 1990 date. So the ruling back then was, when the Food Security Act first started, was you can convert it, you can dry it out, you can remove the trees from it, but you can't do anything with it. You can't farm it. And that created a lot of trouble and a lot of headaches, because I was involved in Southwest Indiana at that time. And it was amazing how quickly the farmer could forget that they weren't supposed to be on that ground. So the next farm bill came up in 1990. They changed the rules so that Food Security Act wetlands can't be improperly converted to land suitable for crop production after 11/28/90. So that was when the 1990 Farm Bill was passed, that said you can't even make land suitable for crop production, even if you're not going to use it for crop production. So no more of this cutting down the trees, removing the stumps, and draining it with the promise that you'll never put it into crops. Doing that would be a violation of your eligibility to participate in the programs. So as always, though, a wetland can be converted. If a wetland converted to cropland before 12/23/85 is taken and itself restored. So you can convert a wetland if you restore another wetland that was converted before 1985. So you got to put one back. The other thing you can do is you can enhance an existing wetland and still stay in the programs, and that would allow you to convert a commensurate piece of wetland to cropland. Or you can actually create a new wetland on a site that doesn't have any wetland history. And of course, you hardly ever see this done because that's a very expensive proposition, and people aren't interested in going that far to be allowed to bring another wetland into crop production. Or if your wetland meets a minimal effect exemption, it can be converted. That's considered a proper conversion. So there's 4 ways that you can properly change a wetland into production ground and farm it. So that's the 3 conditions there for the wetland provisions. So Congress did one other thing. They made a whole list of exemptions for these 2 provisions. And the way they did it was very interesting. And when you read the Code of Federal Regulations, what it says is anybody that breaks out ground and is farming it is creating a violation. Or anybody that converts a wetland is creating a violation, unless one of the following exemptions is met. Now I'm paraphrasing that, but that's exactly how things start out. Everybody is in violation unless they can be found to meet one of these existing exemptions or one of these exemptions. So just real quick, let's run over the HELC exemptions. So if you've got a conservation plan or a system you're following, then you've got an exemption to that first statement that you're creating a violation. And again, if you rely on incorrect NRCS information, that's an exemption that keeps you in compliance. If you're going to break out small areas of 2 acres or less, that is an exemption, unless you're going to take a 10-acre area and keep breaking it out into 2 acres at a time. That's called scheming and devising. And that's got that's a big violation. There is a good faith exemption that FSA administers. I think by now quite a few of you have been involved with FSA on doing one of those. If you converted ground but you're not using it for commodity crops, things like a truck garden, that's an exemption. Minor or technical violations would be an exemption. Or there's a whole list of things that might be beyond your control that would give you an exemption, such as the weather, pest, disease. There's hardships such as illnesses, or so you lose all your equipment, so you have to have your neighbors help out, and they don't have the right equipment for your conservation system. You can get an exemption for that. And actually, I mentioned the hardship exemption. That's the one we've been using for the ephemeral gullies, from the standpoint that we were not telling people that they needed to control their ephemeral gullies. And so we had never been giving them the correct information on how to stay in compliance. So we could no longer deal with that as being a problem. So we had to turn it into an exemption, or what we call a variance, to allow us to start working with people that have ephemeral gullies. So for the wetland conservation exemptions, again, we're starting from the standpoint that if you're farming a wetland, you've committed, you're ineligible to participate in government programs. So you need to try to meet one of these exemptions. So if your wetland was converted before 1985, that's an exemption. The prior converted is an exemption, because you converted a wetland, but it was before the farm bill was, or the legislation was voted on, so you get an exemption. Now that would be like considered what they call a grandfather exemption. Or if you partially converted a wetland before 1985, that would be the farmed wetland or farmed wetland pasture exemptions. If you converted ground after 1985 but before 1990 and don't crop it, then you've got the converted wetland exemption. If you've manipulated a wetland but not made it suitable for crop production, then you get the manipulated wetland exemption. And the prime example of that would be draining a wetland but leaving the trees behind, or at least the stumps, and letting the woody material grow back to show that you have no intention of cropping it. If you compensate with mitigation, and so you're allowed to convert that wetland that you want to crop, that's called a mitigation exemption, mitigated wetland. If your wetland is converted by others, depending on the situation, if you are not involved in it, then you can get a converted wetland exemption, or a third party exemption from FSA. And then finally, the same thing happens. If you rely on incorrect NRCS information and wind up converting a wetland, you will not be held responsible for that. And that is not just if we put the wrong label on it. It also is if we give out improper advice, lead people into thinking that they can take actions that wind up converting the wetlands. So that's why, we stress not to get too specific in your advice on what people can do with a wetland, because if they follow what you're saying and then what somebody else is saying, they can wind up in a situation where they don't have the wetland anymore. And that, of course, would put them out of compliance. But if we can show that it was because of the things that we said and did, then we're not going to hold them responsible for those actions. So that's why we've come up with the fact sheets that get sent out with the determinations to give them a direction on what they can do, but also a warning on what they should be careful about. So that's
Al,
why, yes.
you have a question.
Okay.
What about if FFA provides incorrect information?
Yeah, we an aid.
No, FSA.
Oh, FSA. Yeah, we run
Sorry.
into that all the time. Both of our agencies have procedures for handling a situation when we've made a mistake. So, and we've had to do that when people tell something wrong, and I did that all the time back when I was working in the field, when we told people that you just had to leave your stumps behind, and then when they rotted away, you had to pretend like they were still there and not farm it. Well, that was bad advice. So that's why we don't say that anymore. They have to let the trees come back. You can't just stay off of it. So when we run into those situations, we take responsibility for it and figure out how to document that so that they don't get in trouble now or in the future. And FSA has a similar type of process that they're responsible for doing. So we have to learn to let that go. Those people that feel that FSA is giving them bad advice, and that's happened. The common scenario is when the what are they, PAs or whatever, they were called something back then when this was happening a lot. They would tell a person, yeah, you don't have to worry about a wetland determination on that, or some such thing, and then they'd wind up in trouble. All we can tell them to do is to go to FSA and discuss this with FSA. And then FSA will have to take care of that. So we do not have the authority to say, okay, well, we'll just ignore what's going on here then because of what FSA did. Now, in the past, what I've done, and there's no problem with this, is we've gone to FSA and said, hey, here's Jim. He's saying that this penalty that we're getting ready to charge against him because he doesn't have an exemption, he actually thinks he does because of what you all did with him. So, please listen to what he's saying and tell us, how you want it handled. So
Al,
that
how you
So
have
that's
about,
about as close as, I'm sorry?
you have about 15 minutes to stay on
Yeah.
schedule.
So that's about as close as you can get to getting involved. If FSA it doesn't handle it the way you want it handled, then you know, you're stuck. And you're just, you know, those people are just going to have to you know, live with what happened, but we can't be held responsible for what FSA does or not doesn't do. So we do have monitoring responsibilities. And again, this is something that, you know, we don't hold over people. This is something that we just carry out on an annual basis. 5% of tracks are visited each spring and evaluated, plus tracks that received exemptions the year before. We also have to check those. And then USD employees get checked at least once every 3 years. So while the penalty is an eligibility to participate in U.S. programs, the mode of operation for our monitoring is to seek cooperation with the person in correcting problems and adapting to new information and technology. So again, we're using the monitoring process as a way of staying in contact with the person and providing them assistance to either stay in the programs or get back into the programs. So I guess we've already had a question, but are there any other questions with regard to the regulation process? So we're at a point here where I want to highlight the things on the far right. The arrows law gives us rules, which gives us policy. Another way of saying that is statutes give us regulations that give us policy. So again, for some reason, we've got multiple names for the same things, but laws are statutes, rules are regulations. So when you get training from higher up people, they usually start out with this kind of slide reminding us that our policies are coming from regulations, which come from the law. So they're not coming from the agency, they're coming from Congress. So, and I've already talked about how the Food Security Act manual does not equal the Code of Federal Regulations. If you become a reader of the Code of Federal Regulations, you will be able to nitpick at where the manual appears to have gotten things wrong, and that is actually true. Our policies are sometimes in conflict with the Code of Federal Regulations, so we just have to work our way through that, often in consultation with the national and area people. So are there any other questions? Okay, so what's a wetland? And we're not going to spend a lot of time on these because it's a very complicated process that you have to receive a lot of training for to be able to say that this is a wetland or not. So basically, to be a wetland, you've got to have three things. You've got to have hydric soils, you've got to have ground that becomes saturated or inundated frequently and long enough to support wetland vegetation. And so under normal circumstances, the site does support wetland vegetation. So how do you know when that happens? So let's just take each of those three real quickly, one at a time. A hydric soil is soil that in its undrained condition is saturated, flooded, or ponded long enough during the growing season to develop anaerobic conditions, that's without oxygen, that supports the growth and regeneration of hydrophytic vegetation. So this is ground that will support the growth of a silver maple over the growth of a sugar maple because the ground's too wet. So only the silver maple will be able to take off and grow and thrive there. The second part is land that is inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support a prevalence of hydrophytic vegetation, which is typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. So in the Food Security Act manual, wetland hydrology basically says the same thing: inundation or saturation of the site by surface or groundwater during the growing season. The interesting thing about wetland hydrology is it wasn't mentioned in the Code of Federal Regulations, but they did use the word hydrology in one place. And so what originally was going to be a two-factor determination concept for wetlands, which was just the soils and the plants, had to be adapted to sticking hydrology in there somewhere to make us compliant with the regulations. And so we went to the wetland delineation manual for the Corps of Engineers. So that's why we use that, because we didn't have anything developed at the time where we realized we had to get through with that. So the third part is, under normal circumstances, does support a prevalence of such vegetation. And we call this vegetation hydrophytic vegetation. It means a plant growing in water or a substrate, which would be the soil, that is at least periodically deficient in oxygen during the growing season. So when you have those three things, you have a wetland. And so to make that determination, we have a three-step process. Yes, our agency loves things in threes. The first step that we do is we decide if the site was a wetland by the time 1985 rolled around. So it's either yes or no, is this a wetland or not? And then the second step is, after we figure out whether it's a wetland, then we have to decide what kind of FSA label to put on it. If it wasn't a wetland, then it's either got to be a PC label or an NW label. If it was a wetland, then we've got to look at it and decide if it was a W label or a MW label because somebody's been monkeying around with it, or if it was a converted wetland. All those labels then come into play. And then the third step is just a perfunctory, making sure everything's the right size. Sometimes when you're doing these determinations, you'll wind up with two PCs together that you thought were going to be different, but now you realize they're not. So you just combine those. So that's just the third step. So here's a place for any wetland questions that you got while you're thinking about them or want to raise them. Just a few highlights. When you take the Hydric Soils class, this is always on the pre-test and post-test. Is Hydric soil always considered a hydric soil? And the answer is yes. Once it's a hydric soil, it's always a hydric soil, though it may be drained so that it's dry now, but it's always going to look like a hydric soil. A regular soil, has all sorts of minerals in it and other components that when it's in a wetland situation, they get stripped out because of the water action. Well, once the soil becomes dry, the things that were stripped out don't come back except maybe on a millennial basis. So it's always going to look like a hydric soil. And then I already covered we don't need no stinking hydrology. That's a movie reference, by the way. So I didn't come up with that on my own. If you noticed when we talked about the hydrophytic vegetation, I said a plant growing in water. So any plant growing in water is considered hydrophytic vegetation, even if it's not in our record book of being a hydrophytic vegetation. So sugar maple can be considered hydrophytic vegetation if it's growing well enough in a wet situation. So, and interestingly enough, what that means is if we have hydrology, then we also have hydrophytic vegetation, regardless of what it is. And if there's no hydrology, then all of the vegetation there is considered non-hydrophytic. And that was because somebody wrote the definition using a plant instead of plants. So, you know, we've wound up with this oddity that, you know, we do have to remember that if we mark no for hydrology, we also have to mark no for hydrophytic vegetation on the form. So, and then the final thing is, we do not care if the site is a wetland or not. We don't care if what we're looking at may look like a wetland, but it isn't protected because it has an exemption, because that's not what compliance is about. All we're caring about is determining if the farmer's eligible to be in the programs. Nrcs has a bunch of programs to protect and build wetlands for the benefit of our society. So we make use of those. But we do not use the compliance procedure to go out and save wetlands. So I just wanted real quick to make a couple of comments about planning. So particularly when you're thinking about compliance, make sure you read that case file before you go out there so that you have a good idea what the history of that site's been, because there are lots of ways that something that looks like a wetland may not be a wetland. You want to know if, you know, that field was corn and beans up until 1987 when it became a wetland. So it's not really a wetland. It's prior converted cropland. So you got to be careful about that. And then as far as, I'm sorry, my mouse is going crazy. There's lots of ways to get people down to 2T or T, but every now and then we run across situations where that just can't happen, that the ground is just too fragile and too steep. So those sites do have to go into permanent grassland or non-ag use if that person wants to remain eligible for programs. So sometimes we have these
2 minutes, Al.
Yeah. Sometimes we have these situations where we do run into compliance problems when they're doing conservation planning. You know, that looks pretty bad right there. They've harvested all those trees off the high ground and the low ground, but I've been on sites like that in Pulaski County, as a matter of fact. So, you know, what do you do in a situation like that? What you do is you go back to your resources. First, you go through all your material to make sure you understand what's happening. And then you pull everybody together to help you with this situation. And we've done this before on sites where all of the technology staff and the engineers have gotten together to review what's been going on at a site to figure out what we can do to get them to 2T or T. And, you know, sometimes we were successful and other times we weren't. But, you know, Shannon is real quick to pull us together when somebody's asking for help. So you don't have to do the planning all on your own. You can pull all those people together that I've listed to provide you assistance and advice on what to do to make things work. So that's it. If anybody's got any final questions, just wanted to stress, we're going, you know, we go back to 1985. That was 36 years ago. Farmers do not remember exactly what they were doing that far back. I've found that out from personal experience. So make sure you make use of our records and keep the 85 and 86 slides handy. So that's all I've got. I thank you for listening. And I guess we're done for the day, huh?
All right. Thank you, Al. Does anybody have any questions for Al? All right.
All right. Thank you.
Shannon, do you have any last minute items?
No, just thanks a bunch. Great job. Thank you everyone for your attendance and time and attention. If you have any questions, float those up through your chain of command at the area level and state office level, and we'll get you the information you need. Much appreciated.
Thank you, everybody.